it's Drew, and today's podcast episode is from our 5th recording of Renegade Thinkers Live, our live streaming series. The show was about the CMO job search, like how hiring has changed post-COVID, how to lead virtually, and what to prepare for in transition. To speak on the subject, we were joined by an eclectic mix, Patti Newcomer-Small, who had just started as CMO of FMG Suite, and she talked about her search experience. Sara Larsen, who was in transition at the time and is now the VP of Marketing at Wolters Kluwer Health. Congrats, Sara. And Brandon Palmer, a CMO coach and head of client strategy at Discover Podium. It was a really insightful episode, so without further ado, here it is. I hope you enjoyed it. And don't forget to write a review about it afterwards. Thanks. I'm your host, Drew Neiser, live from my home studio in New York City. And as I like to say on my podcast, hello, Renegade Thinkers. Here we are in 2021. Wow, a year of incredible promises, including the expectation that the pandemic will soon, in months, be behind us, and that our quote-unquote normal lives can resume. But let's agree on one thing. The pandemic, for better or worse, has changed how we work, where we work, how we hire, and how we get hired. Which brings us to the subject of today's show. How are CMOs finding jobs in this virtual environment? How have hiring expectations changed, if at all? What is it to be like? What is it like looking for a CMO role right now? And what should CMOs with jobs be doing today to prepare themselves for their next opportunity? We got a lot of questions to cover. To help us answer these questions and more, we have 3 amazing guests. First up is Patti Newcomer-Small, the star of episode 18 of Renegade Thinkers Unite. That goes way back. And recently appointed CMO of FMG Suite, a software company that supports financial advisors. But before we get to that, first of all, Patti, you have some other big news, right?
I got married.
Yeah, that's kind of a big deal. Wait, so you have a new job and you got married. Did you move too?
That's coming in the next few months. Yes.
Oh my God. That's like the trifecta of transitions. Now, my wife reminded me that I'm not supposed to say congratulations. So wishing you a lifetime of happiness.
Why not congratulations?
I don't know. It's sort of it's like not saying break a leg, you know, it's just one of those things. You say congratulations to the groom and some other wonderful well wishes to the bride. So anyway, so you just also, besides getting married, yes, woohoo, you just found a new job during the pandemic. And I just, how weird was it? Did you meet anybody face to face?
I did not meet anybody face to face, and I still haven't met anybody at my company face to face. Everything has been virtual. The interview process was not all that weird, other than that it was remote and via video. It happened very fast for me. So I had an offer one day, I accepted it the next day, and I started 3 days later.
Whoa, okay, that's the fastest I've ever heard. Oh my gosh, that's crazy. Obviously, you felt really good about both the offer and the opportunity.
That's right, yes.
So talk a little bit about the process from you hear about a job or somebody contacts you about it. How were what was different for you? I mean, in this process?
Yeah. So honestly, for me, I left Intuit this summer, and I actually got engaged 3 days before my last day at Intuit. And so I was really looking reactively and not proactively. So I was taking headhunter calls, but I wasn't really being all that proactive. And so I honestly got a lot of headhunter calls. And one of my big pieces of advice to people is, even when you're not looking, you should always be taking headhunter calls, and B, know who in your network is looking and what they're looking for so that you can be helpful to the headhunters, because then you'll be on their list. And when you are, ready or in the market looking, you'll be on their list. And I think that was really helpful for me. I have always had a philosophy of I take headhunter calls to understand what's out there and what's available and why my resume is interesting and all of that.
It makes so much sense. It's sort of the time to be preparing yourself to look for a job is not when you're looking for a job. And it's right. You build your personal brand and build your profile and build your network so that if in an event you have to tap into it, you can. That makes so much sense.
I always say it's easiest to be doing networking when you don't need to ask for anything. Like, it's really easy. It's easier to network when you can say, what can I do to help you? And then it's a lot easier when you need help because you've put so many points in the bank with your network. And if you just go out to your network and you've never done anything for them and you're just asking for stuff, it's much more awkward.
I totally agree. I know you've had a chance to experience CMO huddles, which is something that we started last year. But one of my favorite huddles is the huddle, and Sara will be able to talk about this, is what we call the transition team. And this is just a group of CMOs who are in the middle of this pursuit. And I know part of the inspiration for this show was actually that group. And I think that's probably a good place to bring in Sara Larsen, who until recently was the CMO of Bright Cove, and I know has been in the process of finding a job. So first of all, Sara, welcome.
Happy New Year, Drew. Great to be here. Great to see you.
Great to see you as well. Sara, for the guest, Sara Larsen was also a guest of Renegade Thinkers Unite, episode 154, just in case you're following along at home. Anyway, Sara, you were a CMO of Bright Cove for quite a while. This is Patti's first CMO role. What advice do you have for Patti? We'll just sort of do a little reverse mentoring here.
Oh gosh, what advice?
The first 90 days.
The first 90 days. First, read the first 90 days. I love that book. I love that framework. Some of the best parts about that for me are finding about how do organizations want to communicate? How do people want to communicate? And especially now with the many people being remote, how do people take information in and how do you build that culture and learn that culture? So that's probably the biggest thing. And then listen, a lot of listening. That first 30 days, no one's expecting you to deliver anything. You can just listen and take in the time. So take advantage of that. I'm kind of one of those people that wants to jump in and do something right away, but I still have to hold myself back and just listen a little bit because that's the best time.
Yeah,
Patti, do you have that book, by the way, First 90 Days?
I've read it. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Great. Can I just add one thing? So the interview process for me wasn't so weird other than it being remote. I have reflected on the onboarding process being remote has been more difficult than I expected to sort of get integrated into things because you don't just run into meetings happening or you meet somebody and say, what meeting are you going to? Can I just tag along? And so you have to be very intentional about how do you get integrated and how do you make sure that you meet people in the organization because you're not going to just run into people in the hallway and in the lunch line or in the coffee line.
Yeah.
One of the things I just started working with an organization a few weeks ago in a consulting capacity, and I created an About Me page. Because here I'm kind of walking in and who is this person, kind of new person coming in. And that I think was really helpful. It gave the team a little bit about me personally. How do I think? I put my Myers-Briggs on there so they knew how my brain worked and a little bit of background about sort of my rules of life and how I approach things. And so that's been helpful because it's a good touchstone for every time I meet somebody.
I love that idea, by the way, Sara. I know at least one CMO who not only did put their Myers-Briggs, and this came up in a podcast, I can't remember which one, but not only put their Myers-Briggs, but said, because this is my characteristic, this is what I respond to, and this is what pisses me off. And they put it right in and just shared it with all their employees, which I think is a brilliant part of this thing. So I want to go back and just say, so in addition, you've got this consulting gig, but how weird has it been for you to have the job search going in this very strange and unprecedented times?
Right. Well, it's been really interesting because I've been approaching it. This is the first time I've really done a true job search, because I've been on sort of the treadmill of life. And so I've been able to sort of step back and really be able to think about what do I want to do. And I've been approaching it like a big research project. And so what that's meant is, figuring out what's the criteria of types of roles, what types of roles are out there, what types of organizations, public, private, PE, VC, pre-IPO, all of those sort of stages, and what type of technology. And so I've kind of been approaching this from really understanding more about the market, because I have never really had an opportunity to do that.
Right. Now, have there been any big surprises in terms of, your research and what you're seeing out there in terms of opportunities and process?
I think the big surprise is that there's an incredible, and I'm in the tech space, there's an incredible amount of optimism. And I think we're in this, world where there's so many sort of bad things happening in the pandemic and and the uncertainty. There's a lot of optimism and forward motion in the tech space in terms of, digital growth, cloud, and really just, the digital transformation that's happening across almost every single industry. And so that's not slowing down one bit. And yeah. I still can remember like the day in 2008 when the world quit buying. Right. And I kept thinking that was going to happen, and that has not happened. I mean, it's actually, people are doubling down.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I mean, there's two economies. If you're in the cloud, you're in a good place. And, they talked about 6 years worth of digital transformation in just a few months in 2020. And those companies are really bullish. And I'm hearing that a lot, that budgets are up and of course, expectations are up. All right, well, let's bring in Brandon Palmer, who is the head of client strategy with Discover Podium, and spend some time. Brandon spends his time coaching CMOs. Hey, Brandon.
Hi. Hey, Drew. Thanks for having me. Really happy to be here.
Hey, and you win for best background, which is real, not fake, real background. So I was looking at your profile on LinkedIn and noticed this recommendation from a mutual friend, JD Dillon. Mm-hmm. And this is a little hype for you, but also there's a question at the end of this.
Okay.
Brandon knows when to listen, when to provide counsel, and when to provide explicit direction. I consider him an invaluable asset for anyone approaching a career transition. I highly recommend his service. So that's cool. That's a nice thing that JD said about you. My question is, how important are recommendations for CMOs in their LinkedIn profile? I know that's a micro question, and we'll get back to the big things, but it just struck me as a moment.
No, it's a great question, and happy to kind of dive into the nitty gritty a little bit for a second. Ultimately, we should all know by now that our LinkedIn profile is equally as important as our resume, right? Recommendations in particular, the important things to know about them is they're never going to generate any traffic to your page. It's pretty impossible for anyone to see any recommendations before they've already visited your page. But it's the only opportunity you have to validate any information you're putting on your LinkedIn profile from a third-party source, right? Because you can ultimately say anything you want to on your profile. It's really important to have kind of concurrent records of other people saying, yeah, this person's great to work with and they have all the experience that they're speaking to.
So get those recommendations, but get them while you're there, not after the fact, which may be a little weird to ask your CEO, hey, how about a recommendation on LinkedIn? But that would be a wonderful validation.
Absolutely.
So stepping back to the bigger question at hand is, you're on the front line of coaching executives. What changes did you witness in 2020 that you think are sort of lasting and will have lasting impact on the job search process for CMOs at least?
So there are the obvious changes, right? Interview processes changed. They moved fully remote. A lot of times timelines became more extended and sometimes chaotic as companies kind of figured out their fit in this new ecosystem. But those are, those will likely kind of start to subside again as we move back to normalcy. Ultimately, the biggest thing I saw for CMOs in particular is an emphasis on the necessity to convey an immediate impact you're going to make in the role. There's the old adage in marketing that it's last to hire, first to fire. And as companies kind of figured out how they were going to survive, it became really important for CMOs through the interview process and in talking through these opportunities to really communicate what they could do in the immediacy to help companies survive. A lot of things like creative aspects, brand development started to fall by the wayside a little bit as there was more of an emphasis on supporting revenue generation.
And it pains me terribly to hear you say that, but I want to get sort of validation on that from Patti. Was that when you went in, was there an expectation that you could be a wizard and suddenly change demand generation as it?
Yeah, not so much a wizard. I think I came into a situation that wasn't broken. But the expectation and the sort of top priority for marketing is definitely generating leads. And so, there's a rebrand, there's what about existing customers, there's how do we think about product marketing. I mean, there's all kinds of things that I've sort of said we need to do these things too, but certainly generating leads is the top priority.
And so I'm wondering, Sara, from your standpoint, when you're having these interviews, is that what you're hearing as well, that they're saying, hey, how quickly could you have an impact on the business?
Drew, I ask every CEO, what's the biggest problem you're trying to solve right now? And that is sort of a guide to what are they going to expect from marketing. In some cases, they're trying to figure out where do they fit in a category, right? And so that's going to be different than just demand gen. Sometimes they're talking about building the pipeline, but they actually don't have a product. And so you need product marketing and you need to, figure out some new product things. Sometimes they're talking about go to market. Because they're figuring out new targeting. And so I think it's kind of zeroing in on what's the biggest problem they're trying to solve and why. And then really actually helping the leadership team see where marketing is going to play a role to help them solve the problem. Because sometimes some CEOs think they know what the answer is in marketing, and it's really our role to help them articulate how to get to that success. So I completely agree with Brandon that you have to be able to walk in the door and have an immediate impact, and do that in a way that's very tied to what that organization is trying to accomplish.
And I want to push back a little bit because we just talked about the importance of listening in the first 90 days and how you have to sort of get the lay of the land and lay the groundwork. And you often know that if there's usually something broken in the demand generation pipeline, you might be able to find a quick fix. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times there is a major positioning problem. And it takes time to fix that. And so you could put a Band-Aid and do a little bit more search or something, but aren't we sort of making a false promise from the beginning and setting up the reason why we're going to be out the door in a year and a half? Is that marketing can, in 6 months can give you 200% return. Who wants to take that?
I'll take it, and then Sara, you take it as well. I actually think, and this is a little bit of my experience this time as well as in previous roles. I actually have been a CMO before. This isn't my first CMO.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
That's okay. And I actually think you can make an impact in a number of different ways. So even just changing the conversation with the kinds of questions that you're asking in the C team conversations and establishing that you have a different kind of experience and credibility with the team so that they see that they're going to learn from you in a way that they might not have expected. And, changing the partnership with sales in a B2B environment in a way that they haven't really experienced before. Like all of those things are ways that you can make an impact fairly early without sort of changing the weeds of exactly how does the engine work, or, do leads go from 214 to 378? You know what I mean? So that's part of my experience with what does it mean to have an early impact. It's not just in the weeds of the projects.
Yeah, and I totally agree, Patty, with what you're saying. I mean, you have to be able to walk in and establish that you've got two jobs, right? You've got your leadership team job, which is where you're going to help solve some of the big, hairy problems in the company. And you have your functional job within marketing, which you're going to optimize and build for success for marketing delivery. And so I think about, and the first 90 days talks about some of this as well, but how do you delineate between some quick wins and some big wins? And the big wins are, Drew, what you talked about is how do you get to that 200%? A quick win might mean that immediate impact so that you can see that your activity is having, an impact right away. And so if you can align with your leadership team, those quick wins and big wins, you're kind of set up and you give yourself a little bit of time to tweak much more of those underlying problems that might need to get solved.
Here's the question that I have. So, one of the big challenges that CMOs face is there's this CEO-CMO mismatch in terms of expectations. And sometimes you can flesh that out through conversations and sitting with the CEO and so forth. Then the next part of the issue is the culture, right? And are you a fit for that culture? And I'm just curious how you can assess culture when you can't physically participate and be around those folks. Is that harder in this period?
Sara, you want to do this one first, and then I'll.
Sure. I mean, I think a couple of things. That calibration piece to the CMO, to the CEO, a CMO in marketing, you've got an incredibly broad skill set that's involved in marketing. And you have to know where you fit on that spectrum, and you got to align that with the CEO and have that very explicit conversation. Like for me, I'm demand gen, go to market, and that's where my experience really spikes. If you want to, and I tell them, if you want a big brand marketer, like that's not going to be me. I know people, but be really clear about where you fit on sort of that spectrum. And if you can figure that piece out together, that's great alignment. And then that kind of leads to the cultural piece. Like, what are the cultural drivers that are important to you? For me, I look at things like, how are decisions made in the organization? How many people are involved? How fast are decisions made? What types of information go into decisions? How are they supported in the organization? How are they communicated? How do you look at whether or not it was a good decision or a bad decision? How do you sort of have introspection? So those are some of the questions that I ask. And then around communication, what's the culture of communication? Is it formal? Is it informal? And how hierarchical is it? And how often are you meeting multiple layers within the organization? So those are kind of the two things I zero in on around culture. And then just the third, which is I think we all should be looking for, is there a values connect with the organization that you're going into? And that can, range in, whatever your values are, you see them reflected. It could be from a diversity and inclusion perspective. It could be from, a global teams perspective. It could be from, just how they're operating in the market. So make sure that your values connect to the organization you're going into.
And Brandon, I'm wondering from your standpoint, how folks should be going about this match of culture. I mean, we talked about immediate impact, and obviously if you're a mismatch, which the culture, it's going to be very hard, but how do you right now sort of figure that out in a virtual world?
It can be really quite tricky. A lot of the questions you ask might not get the definitive answer you're looking for. One strategy I really encourage is to be really genuine to yourself and kind of hold fast to what your values are and be very transparent through the interview process. What that's going to do is it's going to naturally qualify the opportunities. If they don't align with your values, they're not going to move you forward. And that's actually a win for you because you're not going to waste time with opportunities that aren't a good fit. And similarly, when it does resonate, you're going to find that natural match and be moved forward. So it's going to come as a matter of circumstance just by, being really transparent and demonstrating who you are throughout the process.
I love that thought. And I'm thinking back of my podcast interview with Latney Conant of 6 Sense. She was the only person in any podcast who ever said when she applied for a job, she told the CEO that he needed to talk to her last 2 CEOs so that he knew what he was getting. And so there was a complete match of, and she's a bit of a whirlwind, and you can hear it in the podcast. She is just a ball of energy and has very strong views and things. And I love that. It takes a real sense of confidence to be able to put that out there, though, right? I mean, and I know that, and this is not unusual, a lot of CMOs that I talk to sort of will quietly say, yeah, I'm worried about being an imposter. So I wonder, is that as easy and as simple as it sounds? And I'm curious, Patti, did you put your values out there when you were?
I do. I live in 2 cities, and so I have custody of my kids with my ex-husband 50% of the time, and so I need to go back and forth. So I need some life flexibility, and they always say, like, don't share any of that stuff until the very end. I have found that I share it right up front. And it's like, if you need somebody that's going to be in the office from 7 a.m. Monday until 6 p.m. Friday, I am not your girl. Sticking to my commitment with my ex and my kids is the most important thing. And, I will work my butt off, absolutely, but I need a little bit of flexibility. And when there have been a number of things that haven't gone beyond that conversation, but to Brandon's point, then you don't waste your time or their time.
Right.
I love that point. And I suspect, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the pandemic really changed a lot of businesses' perspectives on that.
I would say it took some time. So over the summer, people were still saying, you're going to need to move. We're going to need you in this particular city, blah, blah, blah. By the time the fall came around, it was much more like, yeah, we're going to be remote for at least another year and we're fine. I actually had a couple of opportunities that had reached out earlier in the year. And when I said I can't move to San Francisco, it was done. And then they reached out to me later and said, could you be in San Francisco once a month? And I was like, well, that I could do. And so it from my experience was it definitely changed. It definitely took some time for a number of companies to get there. And I think that there's still a range. There are still companies that are saying, as soon as this is over, we're back in the office. We need you in our city. We're going to be back in the office, but I do think it's going to be a lot fewer. I think corporate real estate is never going to be the same.
Yeah, I'm afraid you're right. I'm curious, Sara, how many of the jobs that you're considering or talking to are saying you got to be in the same city?
There have been a couple, and they've mainly been more Midwest oriented roles. So the coasts seem to be much more flexible, is what I'm finding.
Interesting. And what about you, Brandon? What are you seeing out there in the sense of, because I mean, the great thing as an employer is that now you have this sort of infinite employee pool potential, because we've all figured out how to work together efficiently virtually. So does anybody need to be local?
It seems like it's just common sense. It seems like it should just be easier to work completely remotely, but it takes time to change things. And a lot of companies are still a little slow to move on this, kind of have a more traditional perspective on it. And I ultimately think that this is going to be something that goes with time, but as Sara highlighted, the coasts are the first to move, and then it starts to move in over the next couple of years. I would imagine over the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to be really commonplace for most companies to, when possible, have fully remote workforces. I'm really excited for it personally. I think it's a great direction to be moving in.
I got my home office studio, and I got to tell you, I don't know if Renegade will ever have a physical office again, but we'll see. We got to be like Sean Connery, never say never again. Anyway, Brandon, we touched on this earlier, but I'm really wondering if there is a new skill set, and we're going to call it the virtual leader. And I bring that up because I'm in this back of the book. There's actually 2 copies of Lincoln on Leadership, which I love to pull out. It's just a brilliant little synopsis of the things that this president way back when did. And he was famous for walking around to the battlefield as opposed to just taking the word from his generals. And it was, so whenever you hear about management by walking around, he's was one of the early guys of that. You can't walk around the office anymore. So what are you coaching leaders to do in this new virtual era?
So, as would make sense with not being able to be in physical contact, the real challenge is having your presence be felt, right? Having your team feel your support. And really what it takes is a more proactive approach. As with always, you have to work to identify the communication styles and the best ways to interact with your individual employees to make them feel most comfortable and best supported. But I don't want to encourage being annoying, but maybe a little bit more persistent and proactive in directly addressing individuals to make sure that, you still have an open dialogue and lines of communication.
It's interesting. I've heard a number of CMOs talk about setting up these 10-minute virtual office hours, for example, where they're just open. I've also heard ones that are using all sorts, because Zoom fatigue is such a real thing. They just pick up the phone. Remember that? And they just call their folks to try to create some serendipitous moments. Patti, you're new on this job. How are you building the relationships with your team?
Yeah, I think what Brandon says is right. And I also just have a couple of observations from, I did work the first 6 months of the pandemic at another job. So I think the other thing that happens when you're not in the office is you don't have any of the non-work talk. And so I have found that it's really helpful to set aside time intentionally, whether it's at the beginning of the meeting or the end of the meeting, to sort of check in with people just about how they're doing and what's interesting and what's going on, so that people don't feel like the only thing they're ever talking about is work and work projects, because that can just get exhausting. And then the other one is just, how do you have connection in a way, to Brandon's point, that doesn't just add more meetings, right? So, we've done some Slack conversations and questions that don't have anything to do with work, like a question of the day or question of the week, or, activities that, again, you have to be sensitive to more meetings, because everything became a meeting, right? All of the informal ways that you got stuff done went away. And so everything became a meeting. So people were like, not only am I teaching my kids at home and taking care of my parents and all that, but I've also got double the number of meetings. So how do you add things that allow you to connect with people in a way that doesn't overburden the meeting schedule?
Yeah, I think I had record Zoom meetings yesterday. I think it was like 9. It was chaos. Sara, when you were at Bright Cove, and I know we had many conversations during the early days of the pandemic, how did you find the pandemic challenge your leadership skills?
Well, I think, a couple of things. And I love, Brandon, how you talk about make your presence be felt. And that's different than make your presence be known, right? Yeah, and so, part of being felt is, are people being seen? And what's the recognition culture? And you may have to change the recognition culture in a virtual environment. And it might not be as, formal. It might be, hey, you know what? I heard you did this thing the other day, and wow, it had a really big impact. Or someone told me that you did this, and so just so people know that their impact is being, felt, and to just kind of, meet people where they are as well. The whole notion of empathy and understanding that everyone might be in a little bit different place, and it's evolving. The past, I guess now, almost 10, 11 months have been a roller coaster for people, and they may be at a different spot than they were even 3 months ago. And so continuously check in and listen and be flexible.
Yeah, I love that term, recognition culture. It assumes that exists, which is a positive thing. And of course, empathy. And besides the word pivot in 2020, I think the word empathy and this notion, I use the term that's the end of the business. The business person is all business, right? And I found myself looking at my emails and saying, gee, Drew, are you just being transactional with everything? Because you're going from meeting to meeting and you're just saying yes, no, and you're not stopping and using every communication with your employees or customers or whomever to at least express some empathy. But it takes a little more time. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious how, and maybe Patti, you could talk about this a little bit. How do you balance the need to get so much done and to keep things moving and to keep people, and at the same time, bring this empathy that we so know we need as leaders to bring to the table.
Yeah. I found, I've used Myers-Briggs and other kinds of tools like that for a long time. And I'm an engineer by schooling, and I'm very much a T, and I have no J. And so I always joked that I was heartless. And I felt like the only thing that I did in the first 6 months of the pandemic was do empathy with my team. And, I was saying, if people break, they're not going to be productive. Right. And so in some cases, you've got to take your foot off the gas. And I think we used to do yes, you can work from home if you've already proven that you're great, and you've had to earn some level of trust, and we don't trust you unless you absolutely prove that you can be productive. And I think how do you turn that on its head and say, we've hired adults, they've been through an interview process, they've got all this work experience, they're going to get their stuff done. And if they have to check out to do something, they'll come back. And if they miss a couple hours in the middle of the afternoon, I trust that they'll come back on at night or early in the morning to get it done. And that just has gone such a long way for me to be able to say to people, I'm going to give you some grace. I sort of said my 2 words were empathy and grace. How do I give people grace in an environment where it's a business? Everybody knows it's a business. Everybody aspires to be top performers, but people have lives, and I think Sara said it. It's a roller coaster, and sometimes people are in for I'm all in and I've got this, and other times they're I'm barely hanging on by a string. Can you please help me hang on?
And one of the interesting things that I found as a result of the pandemic is, and I love this, is that I got to know the names of the kids of our clients. I got to know, extended family members, because everybody was showing up on Zoom. And, my dog sort of came in the middle of this show, and there was a moment where my wife's arm showed up. It's our lives, our work lives and our home lives have just converged like never before. And so I think a leader who doesn't recognize those things is obviously tone deaf right now. I am curious if you have some tips, 2 tips for CMOs either in transition already or who are considering moving. What things that should they be thinking about doing to prepare for this new sort of journey that they might consider going on?
I absolutely do. And these aren't necessarily tied into the current circumstances. These are a little bit more far-reaching, hopefully. But the first and most important tip is, if you haven't started yet, start now. Even if you're only considering a transition, just get started. It takes longer than you might think. And particularly if you're being selective, as I would encourage people to do, it's going to take more time. Ideally, you're going to turn down some opportunities that come your way, as well as being turned down by many as well. So there's always a lot of reasons to wait, and just ignore them all. Get started today. And really the best place is just start reaching out to your network. Start some conversations and start talking to people about what's even possible. And my second tip kind of ties into that a little bit. When you're first getting your search started, when you really decide to flip that switch and dedicate yourself to finding a new role, say yes to everything. Every single conversation is meaningful. You have no idea where your next role is going to come from. So just say yes. It doesn't cost you anything besides a little bit of time and focus. And then down the road, once you get a little farther along the process, be incredibly selective with who you accept an offer with. You should have a really strong, warm, fuzzy feeling about the job you're taking before you take it. Otherwise, you're likely to end up in a spot, in 18 months or so, where you're questioning your choices and in another job search. So those are the 2 things I would advise people to do.
So, and Patti, how do those align with your 2 things that you learned from your job search?
Yeah, I totally agree. The only thing I would add to Brandon's first one is change your LinkedIn profile and make sure that it says open to open. You don't have to, there's that open to work thing that's on your picture. I don't know that I am a huge fan of that, but there's a setting in there that basically says, yes, headhunters, you can reach out to me. And I would spend some time on your LinkedIn profile and on your resume. So that would be the only thing I would add to Brandon's. My two are sort of more specific. And I said earlier that that I got a lot of the same questions. So the two things that I would advise people to do is, one, any company that you're going to have a conversation with, look at their website and be able to have some commentary on their website. Everybody thinks that's the test of a marketer, is that you can criticize the website. So almost everyone that I talked to, that's a question that I got. And some of them I had done a more thorough job of looking and assessing than others. And the second one is know and practice your own story. And I think we talked about it earlier about having confidence. Like, everybody asks, like, okay, tell me about your career journey. Tell me where you went, what you accomplished, why you went from one job to another, and figure out how you're going to articulate your story and your accomplishments and your whys for leaving and going to something else, and get really confident being able to tell it and have it be interesting and have some stories in there, because you're going to say that over and over and over and over and over and over and over again.
Yes. So that's it's interesting as you were talking about those two things. It really made me ponder this how you get your insights on websites. And one of the things I would say as part of this is make sure you've made really good friends with somebody at an SEO agency, because they can do a quick run and look at the website and give you a little bit of data that probably the CEO you're talking to has not seen. And it just is a little helpful thing. So you're not only just looking at the website from a standpoint of, judging it based on visuals, but you actually have some data that says, they're not showing up on any of the search terms that they should. Anyway, Sara, and you sort of, again, you were sort of hiring before, you're looking now. What are your thoughts right now for other folks that, things that you've learned along the way right now?
I think a couple of things. One is be able to talk about what you've done, but also talk about how you think. How do you process information? How do you make decisions? What information do you need, and who do you involve in decision making? Because really, at the C level, they assume that you know how to do some of the basics. And so, when you talk about your accomplishments, talk about how you got to those decisions, because that becomes part of the value alignment. Are you going to be going into an organization where you'll be able to use your decision-making process and approach, or are you going to have to adjust it significantly, at least so you'll be able to calibrate a little bit? I think the second piece is talk beyond marketing. Make sure that you're able to describe where you've been, not just in terms of your role within marketing, but what was happening in the business. What was the revenue? How did the deals progress? What did the customer segments look like? What was the product strategy, and how did marketing play a role in helping to define that? And be able to talk to some degree about the financials of the organization. You went from here to there. Profitable, not profitable, took on funding, what did it mean? Not that you have to be a CFO, but have some, if you're talking to a CEO, have some of those, so that you're continuing to position yourself not just as a marketing execution role, but as a business leader in the leadership team that you'll be joining.
I love that. And it reminds me that today, and I did an interview recently with Norman Guadagno, who is a new CMO at Acoustic, which is a new company. And he was fortunate enough to arrive. The first day that he arrived was the same day that the head of HR, the CRHO, started, and whatever that title is. And because they arrived at the same time, they were unified from the beginning. And in terms of building an employee brand, which is so important, right? Because we've got to get employees to talk about the brand, and they need to understand the brand, and we need it for recruiting. So, thinking beyond marketing is such a great advice. And so what I'm thinking about, if you're currently in a job and you don't have a great relationship with your HR person, now would be a good time, because they're going to ask that question. And I've heard that a lot, is they're asking, how do you work with your HR manager, which is not a question they might have asked 10 years ago. The other thought that, when you said, sir, now don't think about you don't have to be a CFO, but you need to be able to talk like one. One of the other things that I've heard a lot of CMOs that have been successful talk about is how they did a little exchange with their CFO and said, hey, teach me about finance, I'll teach you about marketing, and then use that relationship to help develop a model where they would agree, this is how marketing works, and these are the things that we're going to measure. Because when you have that kind of CFO relationship and they believe that marketing will work, they're the ones who will approve it and so forth. Your stories are better, right? So you have a great relationship with sales, a great HR, great one with a CFO. And then, of course, how do you partner with sales? Such a big question on this thing. So Brandon, as you're hearing all of this, and this will probably become a podcast, and we have a few more minutes just to sort of make sure we've imparted all the wisdom that we can in this 1 hour. Was there anything else on your list that you feel we should really make sure that current CMOs or CMOs in transition should be thinking about in preparation for their search?
There actually was one last thing. I really wanted to applaud Sara on her approach in her job search right now. If I had to boil it down to one word that it sounds like you're using, it sounds like you're using a consultative approach through your interviews to really understand the pain points of the organizations. That is paramount. You will find so much more success in being heard and being understood and being respected as a candidate if you can take that approach. So I wanted to put that on a pedestal for a moment and highlight it, because I think it's fantastic that you're doing that.
So, and Patti, I want to come back to you. And so your observation that we sort of went through really quickly is that people were asking the same questions over and over again. And that's a really bad process. That's a problem that organizations need to fix. And that's one of those things that a CMO could do. In fact, working with their HR person saying, you know what, maybe our hiring process is broken. And I'm just curious, what questions should they have been asking?
Yeah, I don't know I don't know. I mean, it's all good questions to sort of get to know you. It's just, the other option, right, is everybody sits in a room together, which would be a little intimidating, right? And it's hard to tell chemistry if you're 1 on 5 or 1 on 6 or 1 on 14 or however many people you talk to. And so I don't necessarily think it's broken. I think they're just natural questions that people ask to sort of get to know a candidate. And it's less intentional than like you ask questions 2, 4, 6, and 8, and I'll ask 1, 3, 5, and 7, and then we'll get together. We just all ask the same 1 through 8. And so it's fine. And, they're reasonable questions. It's just, some of the interview advice says go prepared to be asked 100 questions. And I would say go prepared to be asked 10 or 12 questions. Because if you spend a bunch of time on questions 30 through 100, you're very rarely going to get asked them.
Yeah, I agree. You can always, if you've ever done any kind of media prep, you can control your answers. If you have the right answers, whether they ask the right questions or not doesn't matter as much. I am thinking that there needs to be some improvements. I did an interview with Carol Etienne Spalding from Aptology. There's some technology that you can use. So if everybody's asking the same questions, and get those answers and then circulate those, so then people can then build on the conversation as opposed to starting from scratch. It's just, it's efficiency. So anyway, we've come to that point where I want to thank Brandon, Patti, and Sara. You're all great sports. Thank you to James for that fantastic gin. And thank you, audience, for staying with us. Please join us in 2 weeks when we're talking about the wonderful challenge of marketing to marketers. Cue the music. Renegade Thinkers Live is produced by Melissa Caffrey and Maya Todd. For show notes and past episodes, please visit renegade.com, home of quite possibly the savviest B2B marketing agency in New York City. I'm your host, Drew Neiser, and until next time, keep those Renegade thinking caps on and strong.